Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Please be seated. Good morning. I'm very happy to be here with you this morning. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Jason Poling. I serve as the vicar of St. Hilda's, which is a new church plant in our diocese down in Catonsville, at the site of the former St. Timothy's. And I'm especially glad to be here at All Saints because of the important place that this church has had in my own getting to be where I am now. About 5 years ago, the Bishop Sutton approached me with this crazy idea of starting a new church down in Catonsville and having me be involved in it. And during the 2014-2015 year, I was sponsored by All Saints as a seminarian at the General Seminary. So on Monday mornings, I hopped on the train up to New York and came home Thursday night, and then I was here for the 8 o'clock service on Sunday morning. And Father David Stenner was a mentor to me during that time. I had the pleasure of having the kind support and encouragement of folks here at All Saints. Although I should say that probably my real claim to fame for All Saints is not that I got to serve here as a seminarian and that I was ordained a deacon here, but that Neil Haney was my director back in high school when I was in Loch Raven. And he directed me in Plaza Suite, an old Neil Simon play. And I'm especially happy that I get to serve here with Joan. You know, when you go through seminary, you have to take elements of your ministry context and use those in developing projects. And when I took a church architecture course, I had to bring pictures of the sanctuary, not just the sanctuary, the sacristy, every part of the building. And when my liturgy professor is a very fastidious man. The joke is the difference between a terrorist and a liturgist is you can negotiate with a terrorist. When my liturgy professor saw Joan's sacristy, he said, "Now that is a well-appointed sacristy." So you have impressed at the highest levels. And now, as I mentioned, I'm serving as the church planter, a vicar down at St. Hilda's in Catonsville. Have here with me this morning Alan Hastings, who is my sacristan, and Liz Hale, who is another of our lay leaders. And we are grateful, actually. I see in the prayers of the people today that we're on the prayer cycle. So we would cover your prayers as we do this work that God is calling us to do in starting the congregation. So our text this morning really starts in the last verse of chapter 19. One of the inconvenient things about our Bibles is that it has these chapter and verse numbers, and usually that's helpful. But once in a while, as today, you find out that somebody maybe put the number in the wrong place. The chapter and verse numbers are not inspired. The Holy Spirit didn't drop those in on Matthew as he was writing his gospel. They came along much later. And what we have in our passage in the Gospels this morning, at the very beginning in chapter 19, verse 30, and then at the very end, verse 16 of chapter 20, is this statement of Jesus that many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first. Now this is, of course, not how we expect things to be, right? I mean, he may as well say that acorns will fall up from the ground onto the tree. This is a reversal. It's an upheaval. It's even scandal. Because it's not the way that things usually work in the world, is it? And how things work, how things really work in the world, and in a sense how God has set up the world to work, this is well established. And really that's the background of this story, of this parable that Jesus tells. Jesus tells a parable about laborers working for a landowner, and everything in the parable until the very end works the way things are supposed to work. They work the way they're supposed to work, not only according to human customs, but according to Torah, according to God's commands as to how things ought to happen. We see at the very beginning, in chapter 20 and verse 2, the landowner, having gone out early to hire people to work in his vineyard, agrees to pay them a denarius, the usual daily wage. This is an ordinary, customary thing. You go down to Home Depot, you find some day laborers, and you take them out in the field, and you pay them the daily wage. You agree together on what they're to be. We see here at the very inception of this that work is voluntary. These are not slaves. These are people who are fulfilling their God-given right to enter into agreements to work. And that comes from our essential dignity as human beings. We are made in God's image. God didn't make us slaves. God made us in his image, in his likeness. And we read in Genesis that he created us in his image, and he blessed us, said to us, be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth, subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, over every living creature that moves on the ground. This is sometimes called the creation mandate. But the idea is we are called to work. But we are called to work on a voluntary basis. We're called to work not out of somebody forcing us to, but out of our own essential dignity as people bearing God's image. So, people are working. That's normal, right? And we also find that the people who worked are paid at the end of the day. Might not seem all that remarkable to you until you do work and don't get paid for it. Anybody ever had that experience? My first job out of college, I had that unpleasant experience where I got there and they said, Jason, we have all this stuff backlogged. We'll just go in there, jump in and get done all you can do. And I had moved out from Baltimore. I was still had to pay rent with my roommate here, and I was out halfway across the country, and I had to pay a deposit there, and I was eager to get work done and to get some overtime, and then I get my check, and I worked all this overtime, and they didn't pay me extra for the overtime. I said to the administrative guy in the office, I said, I thought I was supposed to get paid extra for overtime. And he said, yeah, you are. But you didn't pay me for that. No, I didn't. Okay. Are we going to fix this? He said, well, yeah, I'll fix it on your next check. But I knew if I hadn't gone and asked about it, I wouldn't have gotten that money. And frankly, knowing what I know now, I would have said, no, you're going to write me a check right here and now because you owe me this money. And that's in Torah. Actually, God says, do not, and this is Leviticus, do not hold back the wages of a hired man overnight. If I had known my Bible better, maybe I could have dropped that on him. Again, in Deuteronomy, we read that you're not supposed to take advantage of a hired man who's poor and needy, whether he's one of your brother Israelites or an alien living in one of your towns. You pay him his wages each day before sunset because he's poor and he's counting on it. Otherwise, he may cry to the Lord against you, and you'll be guilty of sin. Not only is payment due at the end of the day, payment just basically is due. We find in the prophets, we find Job, when Job is talking about his righteousness. I didn't do anything wrong. There's nobody could ever say that I haven't paid him at the end of the day. The prophets talk about how the people have harmed the poor by withholding their wages. Jesus himself says in Luke chapter 10, he says the worker deserves his wages. And we get in James, the New Testament book that reads the most like the Old Testament. James says in chapter 5, he says, look, the wages you failed to pay the workmen who mowed your fields are crying out against you. The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord Almighty. So payment is due in a timely manner. Payment is due for labor. That's the nature of work, right? You work and you deserve your wages for the work you do. And another reality, another clear statement of the way things are is that, of course, work is work. That's why they call it work. That's why somebody's got to get paid to do the work. The people who come to the landowner and say, hey, what's going on here? We worked all day. We bore the heat of the sun. We expect that we're going to be compensated fairly because we worked for you. We wouldn't have done this on a voluntary basis. This was not charitable activity on our part. But what we also see here, in terms of the way things are, and the way they are strictly according to the law that God had given, is, as the landowner says, do I not have the right to do with what is mine what I will? I mean, this is my money, and if I want to pay this person who worked for an hour the same as I pay you who worked all day, is that your business? I mean, you and I entered into an agreement, right? We at the beginning of the day, I said, I'll pay you a denarius. You said, fine, and you went and you did the work. So I haven't harmed you. I haven't done you any wrong. I have fulfilled the terms of our contract. Go and take your money and get out of here. But, of course, the other thing that is true of the way things are is that other people are always going to disapprove of the way people choose to do with their things as they see fit. And they're also going to do that often out of envy. We've got two commandments, two of the 10 commandments hiding in the background here. The first being, thou shalt not steal. There's no such thing as theft if there is no such thing as private property. You can't have anything stolen from you if it's not yours to do with as you see fit. That's one of the most basic principles of economics that's so basic people often miss it. But we also see that the last commandment is being sorely violated by these folks who work all day. They are coveting the experience of their fellow laborers who only had to put in an hour's worth of work. They're coveting the wage they got for that amount of work, the wage that they got. And all of this is why what the landowner does is so curious. It's so strange. It is not the way that you run a vineyard. Because the next day, when the landowner shows up at Home Depot at 6 a.m., who do you think is going to work for him? They'll say, no, come on back later on this afternoon, and then we'll see. See, Jesus is talking here not about the way things are. He's talking about the realities of God's economy. He's not talking about kingdoms of this world. He's talking about the kingdom of the heavens, as he puts it in Matthew's gospel, or the kingdom of God, as we have in other gospels. That's really the nature of parables. When you think of the very first parable that Jesus tells, the parable of the sower, and he starts off and he says there's a sower, and he goes out to sow. And he sows some seed on the dry ground and some seed on the thorny ground, and he sows some seed on the road and some seed on the good ground. And people, when they hear, they're like, well, hang on a second. What kind of moron is wasting 3/4 of his seeds? I mean, you had to spend all year resisting the temptation to eat your seed corn so that you could plant it when it was time to plant. And now you're going to toss it places it's not going to grow? Well, obviously, when Jesus says this kind of thing, he says, I want to talk about something that's not the way things are. And the same way in this parable, when he talks about what the landowner does. This isn't what effective landowners do. This is not a good labor relations practice. You're going to have all kinds of trouble with the union if you do this. It's much the same in the passage about Israel in Exodus that we heard, where the people are complaining, they're grumbling against God. They have these strange memories of Egypt being a place where they had all that they wanted to eat, leaving aside for a moment the fact that they were enslaved and that they probably did not have all they wanted to eat. They're grumbling, they're complaining against God, just as these laborers grumbled against the landowner. The Greek word there, I love the Greek word, is gongudzo. It's one of those Greek words that just sort of sounds like what people do when they're grumbling, gongudzo. They're complaining and they're grumbling. But it's not just this way with this bunch of landowners or this bunch of laborers. It's not just this way with Israel, as is so often the case when we read these stories. The message here is one for us. See, there's a sharp difference between Anguzo and receiving with gratitude what God has given us. And look at what Paul said in our reading today. Paul says that, to me, to live is Christ, to die is gain. If I go and live in the body, that's fruitful labor for me. But frankly, I'd rather depart and be with Christ. That would be better by far. But it seems like it's more necessary for you that I remain in the body. So, convinced of this, I'll remain, and I'll continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith, so that through my being with you again, your joy in Christ will overflow on account of me. This is what I have, Paul says. This is what God has given me, and I'm not going to grumble about it. In fact, Paul does break out that gangudzo word in the next chapter in Philippians, where he says in verse 14, chapter 2, do everything without complaining or arguing, that you may become blameless and pure, children of God without fault in a crooked and depraved generation, in which you shine like stars in the universe as you hold out the word of life. You see, the truth is, I think all of us should be identifying not with the people who worked so hard all day long and only got the fair wage we deserve, but the message of the gospel seems to be that we need to identify ourselves with the folks that got hired about 5 o'clock. They probably barely got to work before it was closing time and the whistle blew and lined up to be paid. Jesus is speaking to people here who have a sense of what is just and what is right, and he recognizes that and affirms that and says that's true, but I have a completely different paradigm that I need to tell you about. I need to tell you about the paradigm of God's economy, where you don't get what you deserve, because really you don't want what you deserve. What you get is the gracious, the generous, the kind abundance of the good Father who loves us. Dale Bruner, I think one of the most creative commentators in Matthew, says thus the extravagance of the parable ought to be respected. The text stops on the note of the incomprehensible grace of God, and so should we.